Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this evening's event, the Francis Papacy, Reform, Renewal, and Resistance, co-sponsored by the Church in the 21st Century Center and the School of Theology and Ministry. We're honored to have John Allen back to campus, back to Boston College. I think he and I counted this as his fourth time here, and maybe in the last 10 years. John is speaking as part of our Living Catholicism, Roles and Relationships for the Contemporary World, which is our fall theme series. John is the perfect person to bring insights into the growing edges of a living church. He certainly has his proverbial ear to the ground, not only at the Vatican, but all around the world, it seems. We're very excited to have John with us. John's going to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, followed by your questions. We welcome them, your comments. And then we've invited John to sign books in the lobby. You may have seen we're selling a few of his recent books, especially his most recent. I hope John was not offended when I told him that he was the warm-up act to the main event this evening that starts at 8:07 at Fenway Park. But very few people are worthy of that distinction. John Allen for you. But that being said, let me delay no longer as I introduce our speaker this evening. John Allen is a prize-winning senior correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter and senior Vatican analyst for CNN. He's the author of 7 best-selling books on the Vatican and Catholic affairs and writes frequently on the Church for major national and international publications. He's also a popular speaker on Catholic affairs, both in the United States and abroad, especially at Boston College. The London Tablet has called John the most authoritative writer on Vatican affairs in the English language. George Weigel has called him the best Anglophone Vatican reporter ever. John is well known, respected, and trusted by Vatican officials and his peer journalists around the world. Veteran religion writer Kenneth Woodward of Newsweek described John as the journalist other reporters and not a few cardinals look to for the inside story on how all the Pope's men direct the world's largest church, unquote. John's work is admired across ideological divides, drawing praise of liberal and conservative commentators alike. His weekly internet column, All Things Catholic, is one of the most widely read and admired sources of insight into the global church. His most recent book is The Global War on Christians, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Anti-Christian Persecution. John divides his time between Rome and home in Denver, Colorado. He grew up in western Kansas and holds a master's degree in religious studies from the University of Kansas. Please join me in welcoming John Allen.
Hello there. Can everyone hear? Okay, let me begin with this. No matter what happens with you people for the rest of your lives, you will never again have to give any additional proof of your commitment to the Catholic Church than the fact that you were willing to come to a talk on the Pope on the night when the Red Sox are poised to win the World Series. I don't care what happens. If anyone 40 years from now dares question your Catholic identity, I want you to cite this night, and I want you to challenge Boston College to give you a certificate you can frame, okay, testifying to your commitment to the mission of the Church. It is a delight to be here tonight, among other things, because I cover another place where Red Sox are fairly important, and that, of course, is Rome. Although in Rome, ironically enough, it's the Cardinals who wear the Red Sox. Can I also point out this to you? The first time in my life I ever spoke at Boston College was October 17th, 2004. Now, think back. October 17th, 2004 was Game 5 of the American League Championship Series that year. It was the night the Red Sox beat the Yankees 5-4 in 14 innings, propelling them to the World Series championship, breaking the famous curse. And tonight, here I am again on the night the Sox are poised to win another World Series championship. Ladies and gentlemen, don't you agree this qualifies me as Boston's Mr. October? So I promise you, we'll have you out of here in plenty of time to see the game. Now, I have been asked to talk to you tonight about Pope Francis, reform, renewal, and resistance. And so the broad subject tonight is the kind of tsunami in Catholic life that we have lived through over the last 8 months since the election of Pope Francis, and trying to project where that's going to carry the Catholic Church. So let me give you a sense of my game plan. I'm going to begin with some brief thoughts about the Francis effect, kind of documenting the tsunami that he represents. I'm going to spend most of my time trying to outline what I would see as 3 emerging pillars of Francis's pontificate. That is, 3 areas where his interest seems the greatest and therefore where his impact is likely to be the most profound. I'll talk a little bit about resistance to Francis. And then I'll end with a final thought about how we react to all of this, and then we'll see what questions you have and where you want to take the conversation. Okay, so that's the idea. Let's start with some brief vignettes documenting the Francis effect. Let me talk briefly about his popular appeal, his media appeal, and his impact on the culture in Rome. Okay, we'll begin with his popular appeal. Lots of different ways we could document that. I mean, do you know, for example, that 4 days ago, Francis actually crossed the 10 million mark in terms of his followers on Twitter, making him the most followed religious leader in the Twitter universe. Now, he still has some ground to make up if he wants to become the most followed celebrity. Do you know who the single most followed person on Twitter actually is? Justin Bieber. Thank you very much. And surely, ladies and gentlemen, the apocalypse cannot be far behind. Justin Bieber has about 50 million followers. Pope Francis has 10. Do we live in a just world? But nevertheless, that is one slice, one insight into the phenomenon of Francis. Another, of course, would be opinion polls. I mean, it is a fact that in every corner of the universe where public opinion can be scientifically measured, Pope Francis has approval ratings that celebrities and politicians would sacrifice their children to Moloch to acquire. 2 recent polls in the United States, one by Quinnipiac College and the other by the Pew Forum, found that only 4% of American Catholics, 4%, disapprove of the job that the new pope is doing, which fundamentally means that 96% of American Catholics like the new pope. Now, think about what we all know about how badly divided the Catholic Church in the United States is most of the time. I mean, the truth of it is, under ordinary circumstances, it would be tough to get 96% of us to agree that today is Wednesday, okay? In that context, the fact that the Pope has basically a 96% approval rating is remarkable. And frankly, I think if we ever get around to beatifying and canonizing Jorge Mario Bergoglio, this probably could count as the first miracle in that process. Okay? But that's not the window into his popular appeal I want to give you. What I want to do is tell you a little something about his trip to Brazil in July. Of course, Francis went there for World Youth Day. As you probably know, at the end of that trip, he drew more than 3 million people to Rio de Janeiro's Copacabana Beach twice. Okay, once was for the youth vigil Saturday evening, and the second time was the concluding mass the next morning. By the way, shattering the previous attendance record at Copacabana held by the Rolling Stones. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that when you can go on American TV and craft sentences that involve both the Pope and Mick Jagger, you are really on to something, okay? But that's not even the story I want to tell you. The story I want to tell you is what happened on Thursday, which was the day that the Pope went downtown in Rio to the cathedral. The ostensible purpose was to greet a group of Argentinian youth who were in town for the thing. But of course, when word got out that he was going, everybody else showed up. So it was kind of a mob scene. I was in the press bus. We were behind the Pope-mobile. The Pope-mobile pulls up to the back of the basilica in an area that was supposed to be cordoned off, okay? But there was a group of Latin American nuns that had somehow wormed their way into this space. So when Francis steps out of the Pope-mobile, these nuns rush him shrieking like teenage girls at a Justin Bieber concert. Okay, it was unbelievable. And I'm standing there watching all this happen. And you know, theoretically, the Brazilians had deployed 20,000 security personnel, you know, military and police and so forth to prevent this kind of thing from happening. But, you know, they were just standing there watching all this happen. So I pulled one of these guys aside, and I said to him, hey, you know, aren't you supposed to get in the way of this sort of thing? And the guy said to me, look at me, man. I'm wearing a combat helmet. I've got ammo strapped across my chest. I am not going to be the guy caught on YouTube beating up a nun. Okay? It's just not going to happen, you know? There is, and the point of all that is, there is a kind of popular ferment that's been elicited by this Pope that is truly remarkable. All right, that's his popular appeal. Briefly, his media appeal. Again, a lot of different ways we could look at this, but let me give you my personal favorite. Do you all realize that in June, bear in mind, the Pope had been on the job for basically 2 months at that stage. In June, the Italian edition of Vanity Fair magazine declared Pope Francis its Man of the Year. Vanity Fair, ladies and gentlemen, this is not exactly a diocesan newspaper out there someplace, okay? Including, by the way, a tribute from that noted globally renowned Vaticanologist Elton John, who described Pope Francis as, quote, an island of humility in an era of vanity. Okay? Quite a nice line, actually. Now, the thing that is most striking about that, in my opinion, is that Vanity Fair typically brings out its Man of the Year issue in December, logically enough, at the end of the year. In this case, they decided by June, it was already so clear who the winner was going to be that they were willing to call the race. I mean, it's like an American Little League baseball game where they have the 10-run rule, right? Where we're afraid that the winning team is so far ahead they're embarrassing the opposition. I mean, in effect, that's what Vanity Fair did by pulling the trigger on their Man of the Year award in June. All right, so that's his media appeal. Finally, a brief word about his impact on the culture in Rome. Again, many anecdotes I could give you. I mean, for example, it has become customary now when cardinal heads of dicasteries are sending letters to people. You know, heretofore, they would typically sign these letters as, you know, the most reverent, most excellent, most eminent so-and-so. Now they're typically signing these letters just Don so-and-so, okay, and a kind of splash of humility. But, so there are many examples like that, but here's my personal favorite. Bergoglio was elected March 13th. Now, I was shackled to a CNN set for the rest of March, kind of narrating those dramatic opening acts of the papacy. But in April, when I finally was able to spring free from that, I went down to Buenos Aires in Argentina to kind of do the backstory on who Bergoglio was and therefore who Pope Francis might be. I got back to Rome in late April, and I found myself one day in Trastevere, which is a Roman neighborhood where there's a kind of satellite Vatican down there. A lot of the pontifical councils and so on have their offices there. And so I was going out to lunch with a couple of friends of mine from the Pontifical Council for the Family. We were talking about the World Congress of Families that's going to be celebrated in Philadelphia in 2015, which is probably the first time that Pope Francis will visit the United States. And in any way, we're at this little eatery in Trastevere where a lot of Vatican people go. And while we were there, there was this very veteran Vatican cardinal, a well-known guy, who's been around really since the dawn of time. I mean, I actually haven't checked, but my bet would be he got his red hat from Pius XI. Okay, this is how long this guy has been around. And he walked into the restaurant, and normally this guy looks the part. I mean, usually he wears a lot of kind of ecclesiastical finery. But on this particular day, he was dressed very, very humbly, just sort of wearing the black clerical outfit and the Roman collar, and that was basically it. And he started making the rounds of the tables, and he eventually came over to our table to say hello. And so when he came by, I kind of jokingly, made reference to his look, and I said, Your Eminence, what's up? I mean, you just look very different. And he gave me this line that I think probably ought to be printed on T-shirts someplace. Okay, he looks at me and he says, "John, what you must understand is that with this Pope, simple is the new chic." Okay, that's his impact on the culture of Rome. I mean, we could go on and on cataloging instances, but I mean, the truth of it is that Francis has, in 8 short months, sort of captured the imagination of the world and set loose forces in the church that promise to have impact across virtually every zone of Catholic life. So, what I want to do with you now is try to talk about what I would see as 3 sort of clear pillars of Francis's papacy. That is, 3 areas where we can see the imprint of Francis's vision and his agenda in the greatest relief, and therefore areas in which, over time, I suspect his impact and his legacy is likely to be the most pronounced. And those 3 areas are, 1, leadership as service, 2, the social gospel, and 3, mercy as the spiritual cornerstone. Okay, mercy as the spiritual cornerstone. So let's start with leadership as service. Of course, many of the early sort of flashes that we saw from Francis, the things that really sort of took the world by storm and shaped the narrative about this Pope, were about his personal simplicity and his personal humility. So things like taking the bus with his fellow cardinals rather than taking the chauffeur-driven papal limousine, deciding to live in room 201 of the Casa Santa Marta rather than the papal apartment, wearing the same simple brown shoes he had brought with him to Rome from Argentina rather than the kind of red shoes that we typically associate with the papacy. Going back to the clerical residence he had been staying in the run-up to the conclave and packing his own bag and paying his own bill, rather than having somebody do it for him. And on all of that, let's be clear, at some level comes out of the personality of Jorge Mario Bergoglio. It's very much who the man is. One of the things I did when I was in Buenos Aires is that I went to the apartment that he had lived in, because in Buenos Aires, famously, he did not live in the Archbishop's residence. He lived in a very simple apartment downtown. And one of the things about that apartment you should know, and the landlord explained this to me, is that during weekends in the winter, he had to leave the stove on all day Saturday and Sunday because there was no heat. No central heat in this building. And so in order to sort of stave off a chill, that's what he had to do. Bergoglio also famously did not take a car and driver from his apartment to work. He took the bus like everybody else. So to some extent, this is just who the guy is. But I think very self-consciously, Pope Francis was also trying to kind of recalibrate and redefine what leadership in the church is supposed to look like. And of course, this is not just a matter of symbolism. The Pope has also verbally laid out a vision for leadership in the church. On June 24th, he had a meeting with all of the nuncios, that is, the papal ambassadors in various parts of the world who play a lead role in selecting new bishops. And he described to them the kind of bishop that he is looking for. He said what he wants is not someone who suffers from what he described as the psychology of a prince. Okay? Instead, he said, what I am looking for is a pastor who has the smell of his sheep, because he is close to the ordinary people that he is called to serve. Okay, so that's the vision that Francis has presented. And of course, we now have evidence that Francis is willing, albeit in somewhat gentle fashion, to give that vision teeth by intervening when bishops are not necessarily abiding by it. And the proof of that is his intervention in the Diocese of Limburg in Germany. This is the now infamous Bling bishop. You all heard this story? Okay, the bishop of the Diocese of Limburg, a guy by the name of Franz Peter Tabarts von Elst. I mean, the name just sounds, aristocratic. The truth of it is, he actually comes from a family of poor farmers. But in any event, He has become globally infamous, of course, because he spent an estimated $42 million on remodeling the diocesan center and the bishop's private residence, including, again infamously, $1.1 million on garden landscaping and $22,000 on a bathtub. I don't know what kind of bathtub you can buy for $22,000, but I'm sure it's a very nice one. And, actually, if we want to be fair, there's a defense to be made of this. Much of that diocesan center is not the bishop's private quarters. It's a kind of monumental complex that belongs to the archdiocese. It's on the Register of Historic Places in Germany and so on. But whatever. The perception globally, basically, was that this was a bishop who obviously didn't get the memo. Okay? And so in September, Francis dispatched an investigator to the Diocese of Limburg in the person of Cardinal Giovanni Laiolo, former, basically, Secretary of Foreign Relations in the Vatican, and then later the governor of the Vatican City-State. In October, Francis called both Thebarts von Elst and the president of the German Bishops' Conference, Archbishop Robert Zolich of Freiburg, to Rome for consultations. On the back of that, he made the decision that this bishop needed a sabbatical. So he's given him an indefinite period of time outside the diocese. In the meantime, he's appointed another administrator. Bishop Thebarts von Elst right now is arranging to spend his time away at a Benedictine monastery in Bavaria. And in the meantime, the Archdiocese of Limburg is now debating what to do with this spruced up diocesan center. The leading theories are that it's either going to be turned into a center for refugees or into a soup kitchen, a kind of social service center. But in any event, it will have a very different destiny, okay, than the one that was originally envisioned. And all of this, I think, illustrates the fact that Francis, and again, he could have been much harder on this bishop. He could have demanded his resignation and so on. But I think part of the reality is the guy is only 53. He's not going to be 54 until November 20th. I think Francis believes that if he can kind of turn things around, he can give service to the church down the line. But all of this sends a very clear signal, I think. It's a kind of shot across the bow to the Catholic world that Francis expects this vision of a kind of humbler, simpler form of leadership to be owned by, and we're not just talking about the bishops. I think we're talking about anybody who is in leadership in the church. I think he expects the leadership class of the church to own this vision. And at the end of the day, I think what Francis is concerned with is this is a man who is very plugged into how ordinary people, even those who aren't necessarily faithful churchgoers, how they see the church. Okay? And I think he understands that there is a kind of tendency in the postmodern world when people see the symbols of leadership in the Catholic Church, when they see Roman collars and pectoral crosses and so on, he understands that there is a tendency for people to think in terms of power and privilege and control, and instead he wants them to think of service and fidelity to the gospel. I think he's trying to, in that sense, recalibrate the kind of images that the symbols of office and the symbols of leadership in the Catholic Church evoke. Okay? So that's leadership as service. Let's talk briefly about the social gospel, the second pillar of what I would see as the kind of emerging physiognomy of Francis's pontificate. I think there has been some confusion about where Pope Francis stands vis-a-vis the life issues. As you know, twice now, once was on the papal flight from Rio de Janeiro to Rome on July 28th, where Pope Francis gave this hour and 20-minute impromptu press conference. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I was on that papal flight, and let me just tell you this. In many ways, Alitalia Flight 4001 from Rio to Rome on the 28th of July was nothing to write home about. The seats were uncomfortable, the food was mediocre, but I will give it this. The in-flight entertainment was spectacular. Okay, because what we had was a pope without any filters and without any controls, just off the cuff, taking every question under the sun and giving you honest answers. So on that occasion, and then again in September, in his interview with 16 Jesuit publications that was organized by Civiltà Cattolica, which is the Jesuit-edited journal in Rome, on those two occasions, Pope Francis has said that he does not believe it is essential for him to talk frequently about issues such as abortion, gay marriage, and contraception, because the positions of the church are well known on those issues, and therefore won't necessarily benefit from repetition. Now, in some quarters, this has been understood as the Pope kind of backing away from the gospel of life. I think that is the wrong reading of what Francis is up to. It is worth noting that the day after his interview with those Jesuit publications appeared, he gave a speech to a gathering of Catholic doctors in Rome, which is actually one of the strongest and most forceful pro-life speeches you will ever see a pope give, in which he defined the right to life as the primordial right to life and the cornerstone for all the other rights that people enjoy in virtue of their human dignity. So I don't think it's about surrender on the life issues, but I do think that Francis, as the first pope from the developing world, and again, as a pope who was very in touch with how ordinary people perceived the church, believes that there are other elements of Catholic social teaching that have not been given the same emphasis, which deserve to see the light of day. And I think it is no accident that the three gutsiest political interventions we have seen from Francis to date are all around elements of the social gospel. Those three interventions are his trip to Lampedusa on the 8th of July, his visit to a favela, that is a slum in Rio de Janeiro, on the 24th of July, and the day of prayer and fasting he called for peace in Syria on September 7th. Start with Lampedusa. This was actually, his first trip outside of Rome was not the trip to Brazil. It was this trip to Lampedusa, which is an island in the southern Mediterranean. It's considered part of Sicily, which is a major point of arrival for impoverished migrants from Africa and the Middle East who are seeking to get into Europe. And on that, it's a very perilous place, because what typically these migrants will do is they find their way somehow to either Tunisia or Libya, and then they board these very rickety boats and try to make this crossing over the Mediterranean. Thousands of them have died. Over the last decade alone, the estimate is some 20,000 people have died trying to make that crossing. And Francis's visit was actually prophetic, because he's there on July 8th. 2 weeks later, there is a boatload of 500 refugees from Eritrea that is trying to make its way to Lampedusa. The boat capsizes off the coast of the island, bursts into flame. Of those 500 people, 340 of them died, and only about 160 survived. So when Francis went to Lampedusa that day, he not only spent hours in a refugee center listening to people's stories, consoling them, embracing them, making the church present to them in his own person, he also boarded a boat and went out to the sea and laid a wreath in commemoration of all those who have died trying to make the crossing. And then he gave a powerful speech in which he condemned what he called a globalization of indifference to the fate of migrants and refugees, a globalization of indifference. So his first powerful, notable political outing was basically devoted to making a pro-immigrant, a pro-migrant statement. July 24th, when he's in Brazil, was the second sort of very overt political statement made by this pope. That's the day he chose to visit the favela, or the slum, of Varginha. You probably know that when the Pope's trip to Brazil was originally planned, it was planned for Benedict XVI, okay? And then Francis inherited it. He made two adjustments to the itinerary. One is he added a day trip to the sanctuary, the shrine, the Marian shrine of Our Lady of Aparecida, who is the national patroness of Brazil. And this is because Bergoglio has a profound belief in the importance of popular devotion, popular religiosity in Latin America. The other adjustment he made to the schedule was he wanted to stop in the favela. And by the way, this indicates, among other things, how politically savvy a figure Jorge Mario Bergoglio actually is. Because you may remember, in the run-up to the Pope's trip in Brazil, the other thing that was going on in that country at the time is that hundreds of thousands of Brazilians, particularly young Brazilians, were in the streets to protest what they saw as injustice to the poor. And specifically, what they were protesting was the expenditure of a truckload of public money on splashy events like the World Cup and the Olympic Games, while basic services such as education and healthcare and so on languish. Okay? Do you know what else Pope Francis was scheduled to do the morning he went to the favela? What was on the official itinerary is that he was going downtown to the city hall to bless the banners for the Olympic Games. Had he done that in isolation, I think the takeaway in the streets of Brazil would be that he's siding against the critics and in favor of the establishment. Okay, so by adding the trip to the favela, he kind of balanced the scales and made it clear that his sympathies were with everyone. But in any event, that particular favela, that particular slum, Varginha, is known as the Gaza Strip of Rio de Janeiro. It's been the site of bloody clashes between rival drug gangs and between the police and security forces and the gangs and so on. A year ago, the officials in Rio had unleashed a phalanx of armored personnel carriers and tanks in that particular favela to try to pacify it. So they basically bulldozed all the resistance and then claimed that peace had been restored. So on that day, in that spot, Pope Francis stood there and he said pointedly, no program of pacification will ever be successful if it does not address the root reality that too many people in this society are marginalized, too many people in this society are forgotten, and too many people of the society are excluded from the new opportunities being created. And until you address that, no real lasting peace will ever be created. It was probably, in context, the most overt political message that he's delivered since his election as Pope. He then went on, speaking in this spot, and by the way, I was there that morning. He was speaking in a kind of dilapidated soccer field in this slum. It had been raining all night and raining that morning. It was wet and muddy and cold and just awful. But he was standing there in the open air addressing the poorest of the poor of Brazilian society. And he said, if you hear nothing else from me today, I want you to hear this. My message to you is that the church is with you. The church is with you. And what he meant by that is not merely that the church sympathizes with your plight. What he meant is that on my watch, the church is going to be here. We will be in this slum. We will share your lives with you. We will share your journey with you. And whatever your experiences are, whatever fate has in store with you, we will be standing alongside you when it happens. Okay? And I will tell you, it played extraordinarily well. I was standing in the back of this crowd. There was a guy who came up to me who lived in this slum, who first of all started trying to talk to me in whatever like the indigenous dialect is, and I had no idea what he was saying. And so he then shifted to Portuguese. And I don't really have much Portuguese either, so I still had no idea what he was saying. So then we shifted to what two people do when they don't have a common language, right? Which is hand gestures, right? And so he started drawing a circle, okay? And what he meant was he was talking about the slum, the place he lived, right? And he sort of did like that to indicate he didn't like it. Then he pointed up to Pope Francis and he gave him a thumbs up. So basically, the vox pop from Varginha that day was slum bad, Pope good. Okay? In other words, his message got through. All right? So that was the second political intervention, which basically is a statement of solidarity with the poor. And that brings us to September 7th. As you all know, not so long ago, the Western powers, the United States included, were beating the drums of war with regard to Syria. We were on the brink of launching military strikes in Syria. Pope Francis basically unleashed a full-court diplomatic offensive against that idea. The Secretary of State in the Vatican brought in all the ambassadors accredited to the Holy See for a briefing laying out the case against the use of force in Syria. The Pope has used every tool in his toolbox to get the anti-war message out, including his Twitter account. And on September 7th, he called a global day of prayer and fasting for all of the 1.2 billion Catholics in the world to pray for peace, including himself personally presiding over a deeply moving and evocative penitential liturgy in St. Peter's Square. So that third statement made by the Pope had to do with opposition to war, the promotion of peace. So my point is that I don't think it is any accident that the three most incisive and visible political statements made by Francis since his election have to do with immigration, poverty, and war, core pillars of the Church's social gospel. Now again, don't miss my point. My point is that it does not imply a repudiation of the pro-life positions of the Church and of previous papacies, but it does imply a desire to kind of lift the rest of the church's social gospel into a position of rough equality with those other teachings. All right? Finally, mercy as the core spiritual message of this pope. Mercy. Enzo Bianchi, who is the founder of the famed ecumenical community of Bosè in Italy, recently did a statistical analysis for the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, which is like the New York Times of Italy, of all the words used by Pope Francis since his election. And what he found is that mercy, by far, was the landslide winner, the single term used most commonly by Francis since he was elected. It's there in his motto. You know, his motto as Pope is a quote from the Venerable Bede. It's kind of a complicated Latin formula, but basically it means by having mercy, by choosing through the eyes of mercy, choosing through the lens of mercy. Okay? When he celebrated his first Mass as Pope on the 17th of March, 4 days after his election, his first Sunday Mass, I should say, he chose to do that not in St. Peter's Basilica, but in the parish church of St. Anne's, which is the church where Vatican personnel go to just for their regular Sunday liturgy. Oh, and by the way, he created a minor diplomatic sensation because St. Anne's Church is right on the border, basically, between the Vatican City State and Italy. So this huge crowd, when word got out that Francis was going to be here, this huge crowd formed on the other side of the street. And when Francis came out after Mass, not only did he stand outside the church and shake people's hands, like he's the world's parish priest, but when he was done, he saw this huge crowd across the sidewalk, and he just walked across the sidewalk to plunge into the crowd, crossing an international border and creating a minor diplomatic crisis. I mean, I'll tell you, most people around the world are terribly charmed by Francis. One constituency that isn't quite as excited are his security personnel. He's driving those guys nuts. Back to that papal flight, there was a moment when one of my colleagues asked Pope Francis about a remark he had made where he talked about how he felt a little ingabinato as Pope, that is, kind of put into a cage. And so somebody asked him, what does that mean? And he said, well, one of the things I really miss is that it used to be when I came to Rome, I would take walks through the city, and I love doing that, and I wish I could do that as Pope. Well, while he's saying that, Domenico Gianni, who's the head of his security, the head of the Vatican gendarmes, the guy who's responsible for the personal security of the Pope, was standing about 3 feet away, and his eyes got as big as dinner plates, because you could tell he's thinking, my God, he might actually mean it, right? So, that's Francis in a nutshell. Anyway, when he went to celebrate Mass at St. Anne's on the 17th, he kind of laid out a program of governance in miniature, and the heart of his homily that day was the line that the strongest message of the Lord is mercy. The strongest message of the Lord is mercy. Again, on the papal plane, he said that he believes the present moment is a kairos, okay, deliberately using that Greek term from the New Testament that means a kind of privileged moment. He said that the present moment is a kairos of mercy. It is a moment in which the world desperately needs to hear the Lord's message of mercy. Over and over again, he continues to come back to this. On the 26th of May, he made his first visit to a Roman parish. Popes typically try over the course of their papacies to get around to visit as many churches in Rome as they can because they are, of course, among other things, the Bishop of Rome. So on this particular day, Francis was going to visit Saints Elizabeth and Zechariah Parish on the outskirts of Rome. The pastor there is a Romanian immigrant, a guy by the name of Father Beoni Ambris. The Italians call him Padre Ben. The Pope was scheduled to get there at 10 o'clock in the morning. At 9:15, Padre Ben picks up in his ear the rotor wash of a helicopter, okay? And he's thinking initially this is the Carabinieri, the Italian security, right, who are there to provide protection. Turns out, no, it's actually the Pope's helicopter. Okay, so Francis lands 45 minutes early. He pops out, and he says to Padre Ben, listen, I'm sorry for the early start, but in addition to saying Mass and in addition to meeting the parishioners, what I would really like to do while I'm here is hear some confessions. Okay. Now, this was not part of the program, okay? So Father Ben runs and grabs 8 people at random, okay? And he says to them, you're going to confession. And he told me this story later. They looked at him and they said, well, that's very sweet, Father, but we're actually here to see the Pope. He said, that's exactly what's in the cards. Okay. So he brought them into the confessional in the church, and one by one, Francis sat with them and heard their confessions and administered forgiveness. Now, I think in part he wanted to do that simply because he takes the role of Bishop of Rome seriously, and he thinks of this as part of the pastoral responsibility of the local bishop. But I think in part, too, he wanted people to see the Pope at the Catholic Church making a point out of celebrating the Church's premier rite of mercy. It's all about that kairos of mercy. Ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you this. I have now covered 3 popes. And all of these, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, they have all been complex men, and you can't just boil them down to simplistic sound bites. But there is nevertheless a sense in which each one of these popes kind of has a signature phrase that captures the heart of what they're about. Now, with John Paul II, there is no doubt whatsoever what that signature phrase was. It was, be not afraid. Be not afraid. His call, his invitation to the church to sort of recapture its self-confidence, and if you like, almost its evangelical swagger, after a period of sort of introspection and self-doubt in Catholic life. Again, with Benedict XVI, we don't have to speculate. That signature phrase was reason and faith. Okay, the heart of Benedict's proposal to the postmodern world is that reason and faith depend on one another. They need one another. That faith shorn of reason becomes fundamentalism and extremism. That reason shorn of faith becomes skepticism and nihilism. That to be healthy, they have to be in relationship with one another. Okay? And again with Francis, I know it's early in the game. We're only 8 months in, but already I think it is crystal clear what that signature phrase of Pope Francis is. It's something he has repeated so often that it's become a mantra. If he keeps going like this, I think they will print it on bumper stickers and put it on the buses, okay, in the Vatican city-state. And that line is, the Lord never tires of forgiving. The Lord never tires of forgiving. Look, I think Francis is very well aware that a minister of the Christian gospel is obligated to pronounce 2 things to a fallen world. That minister is obligated to pronounce God's judgment on a fallen world, and he is also obligated to pronounce God's mercy. Thing of it is, I believe Francis's calculation is that the world has heard our judgment with crystal clarity. Now it is time for the world to hear and experience our message of mercy. And I think if you really drill down, what you would find is that absolutely everything Francis is doing, from the nitty-gritty details of how do you restructure the Vatican Bank, all the way up to the loftiest matters of theology and pastoral practice, I think all of it fundamentally is predicated on his desire that when the world looks at the church, they will see a community of mercy, a community that does not merely pay lip service to mercy, but actually practices it in terms of its internal life. Okay? So that's mercy as his cornerstone. Now, part of my title tonight, of course, referred to resistance. So let's talk about that for a moment. Despite what I said earlier about the generally rave reviews that Francis is drawing, it is nevertheless the case that there are some important constituencies inside and outside the church in which one can detect some ambivalence or some concern about some of the things we have seen from the new Pope. I wrote a column recently in which I talked about Pope Francis's older son problem. Okay, and this is a reference to the parable of the prodigal son. Over his first 8 months, Francis has done a masterful job of reaching out to the prodigal daughters and sons of the postmodern world. But I think there are some older sons in the church, people who would perceive themselves as loyal Catholics who have been carrying water for the church for a long time, who are feeling a bit left out. And I think if we look around, as of today, we could identify at least 5 such older sons. One, I think there are some pro-life Catholics who worry that Francis's determination to dial down the rhetoric on issues such as abortion, gay marriage, and contraception amounts to a kind of unilateral disarmament in the culture wars. Second, I think there would be some doctrinal purists, some in the theological community, who would worry that the Pope's kind of freewheeling, let it all hang out, shoot from the hip style sort of risks confusion about some core elements of church teaching, matters of not secondary import, such as sin and salvation and so on. Third, I think there would be some liturgical traditionalists who feel that this Pope does not foster the same spirit of reverence and even awe for the Church's worship that they would associate with Benedict XVI. Fourth, I think there would be some political conservatives who would be concerned that all of this talk about the social gospel, if we're not careful, could shade off into a kind of uncritical embrace of the political agenda of the secular left, even on things that really have nothing to do with matters of the faith. And then finally, fifth, I think there are some church personnel, and in particular, people who work in the Vatican, who quite honestly are just a little tired of hearing the Pope take pot shots at them, you know? I mean, hearing Francis describe them as careerists, as infected with the leprosy of a royal court, as, you know, being excessively Vatican-centric, okay, and all of that stuff. And listen, I mean, two things about that resistance. And I'm not sure any of it is really yet explicit resistance. I would describe it more as ambivalence. But of course, there's the danger that it could grow into resistance. Two things I would say about that. One, if there's nothing else you take away about Jorge Mario Bergoglio, know this. This is an incredibly politically astute man. I think he is well aware that ambivalence is out there, and I think over the course of time, he's going to do what he can to try to reach out to those folks. Second, at a more spiritual level, this is a pope who is profoundly committed to the unity of the church. I mean, if you don't believe that, you should go find the address he gave in his general audience on the 25th of September. You can find it online. The entire reflection is devoted to the theme of unity in the church, and it is a masterful, beautiful kind of pastoral reflection. You probably know that next April, Pope Francis is going to be canonizing two of his predecessors, John Paul II and John the 23rd. It's actually going to happen on the 27th of April, which is Divine Mercy Sunday. And that in itself is, of course, a statement about unity of the church. But there's a line associated with John the 23rd, which I think Pope Francis also understands very well and will take to heart. The line is this: amid the ferment of the Second Vatican Council, Pope John was asked how he saw his role. And his answer was, I have to be Pope, both for those with their foot in the gas and for those with their foot in the brake. Okay, I think that's an insight that Pope Francis also understands and will act upon as time unfolds. Here's the final thought I want to present to you here tonight, which is, apropos of the varied reactions that Pope Francis has elicited, and apropos of trying to foster unity in the church, I think Francis will do what he can, but I think all of us could also help him out if we try to do what we can in our own spheres of influence to foster an appreciative and unified response to the new impulses that Francis is unleashing. Here's my premise. Okay? And on this point, I speak tonight as a media professional. Okay? I will tell you for sure that in the global media culture, Francis has absolutely changed the narrative about the Catholic Church. Prior to March 13th, the dominant media narratives about the Catholic Church were sex abuse crisis and Vatican meltdowns and bruising political controversies. And while none of those things have gone away, today the dominant narrative in the global media about the Catholic Church is rock star Pope takes world by storm. Okay? Now, we are, as Catholics, theoretically committed to evangelization. Under both John Paul II and Benedict XVI, the new evangelization emerged as the highest internal priority of the Catholic Church. Okay? I would submit to you that Pope Francis represents a historically unique and precious evangelical calling card. Basically speaking, what Francis represents is an opportunity to reintroduce an often jaded and cynical secular world, a wide swath of which had tuned out the Catholic Church a long time ago, to reintroduce that element of the culture in a positive key to the Catholic message. And so the question is, how do we best take advantage of that? Well, I can tell you one good way not to take advantage of that is by allowing the momentum generated by Francis to be sucked into the internal tribal rivalries of the Catholic Church that often represent us at our most disedifying and distressing. Okay? There's an old joke that kind of makes the point. I don't know if you all have heard this, but the joke goes like this. There's a dad who was sitting in his living room, okay, and he hears a ruckus upstairs, okay? So he walks up the stairs, and he finds his kids sitting in a circle in folding chairs, screaming their lungs out at each other, okay? Like, you're an idiot. No, you're completely wrong, and I can prove it, et cetera, et cetera. And so the dad says, well, what in the world is going on here? And one of the kids looks up and says, oh, don't worry, Dad. We're just playing church. Okay? Which sort of tweaks the fact that religion, I suppose because it speaks to the deepest passions of the human soul and all that, I mean, often religion seems to breed division almost as reliably as it does devotion, right? And we in the Catholic world are no, strangers to that dynamic. Well, here's the thought I want to leave you with, ladies and gentlemen. I would invite you to resist the temptation to play church with Pope Francis. Okay? By that I mean, if those who are most enthusiastic about this Pope can resist the temptation to use his words and deeds as a club to beat up on others in the church they don't like, okay? And if those who are most ambivalent about this Pope can resist the temptation of a rush to judgment and instead wait to see how this plays out before they draw conclusions about what it all means, then I think we may be positioned to take maximum advantage of the absolutely unparalleled missionary opportunity that the cachet of this Pope represents. Because what we don't want is for the personal popularity of Pope Francis to remain just an artifact of pop culture. We want that to be an invitation to faith. And I guarantee you, folks, we now have the attention of the world. But if what they see when they look in on the Catholic Church is a bunch of people squabbling over what the Pope means and where he's going, that is not an evangelically attractive image to project. If instead what they see is a community united to try to take advantage of the Pope's emphasis on leadership as service, on the social gospel, and on mercy as a core spiritual principle, if they see a community genuinely committed to that, and enthused to carry forward that project in the postmodern world, then I think we stand a decent chance of being a missionarily and evangelically effective agent in the lifestyle smorgasbord of the postmodern world. And I will tell you that spirit of unity and avoiding the one-way street, the blind alley of playing church with the Pope, that, ladies and gentlemen, is a winning strategy for the pastoral life of the church in the 21st century, every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Thank you. God bless you. God bless Boston College. Go Sox!
So we have time for a few questions. And if you're interested in asking a question or making a comment, we have 2 microphone stations there in the center.
Excellent job. Forgive me if this is not a fair question to ask, but I can't help
There
but
are no
ask it.
unfair questions here tonight.
With the popularity of Pope Francis, my question is, why do you think he wasn't elected after Pope John Paul's passing?
All right. Did you all hear the question? I mean, given how hip and all that Bergoglio seems, why wasn't he elected the last time when he was in the running in 2005? Basically, I think you have to understand that the radical difference in the dynamic that shaped those 2 conclaves. In 2005, the basic voting issue for the cardinals who elected a successor to John Paul II was continuity. They believed that John Paul II had unleashed massive new dynamism in Catholic life. And listen, I mean, and maybe in some ways to understand this, you had to be in Rome in those days. But I mean, I was there. I mean, in addition to the 5 million Romans who showed up to mourn the death of the Pope, the city of Rome estimates that 5 to 10 million extra people came through Rome in those days to mourn the death of the Pope. I mean, on CNN, we interviewed a guy who was from Chicago, okay, who, when he heard that John Paul had died, okay, he was a bus driver. He took all of his accumulated vacation time, okay, cashed it in, got a ticket to Rome, packed a bag, thought what he would do is land at Fiumicino, go to pay his respects to the Pope, then spend 3 or 4 days in Rome, and then come home. Well, of course, the truth is, with 5 million people in line, what happened is he landed at Fiumicino, got in a cab, got as close as he could get to St. Peter's Square, which was several blocks away, put himself into the line. He spent the next 72 hours in that line with his suitcase in hand, finally got up to pay his 5 or 10 seconds of respects to the Pope. By that stage, his vacation was burned. What he did was he hopped in a cab and went back to Fiumicino to go home, and he told us on air it was the most moving experience of his life. And if you multiply that by 5 or 10 million times, that was the story of those days. Okay, so the cardinals going into that conclave believed that they had just witnessed the close of a historically significant papacy. Okay, and they were looking around at who among us is best positioned to keep the legacy of this papacy alive. And obviously, the man who had been the intellectual architect of Wojtyła's papacy, his right-hand man in some ways for 21 years, and who had presided over the College of Cardinals during the interregnum, Joseph Ratzinger, and done a masterful job of it. I think it didn't take them a long time to arrive at him as the obvious choice. So the huge voting issue in 2005 was continuity. By way of contrast, the huge voting issue in 2013 was change. I think you would have to go back probably to 1922 to find the last time the Cardinals were in such a palpably anti-establishment mood as they were in 2013. And in this case, what they wanted to change wasn't the teaching legacy of Benedict XVI. It wasn't his proposition on reason and faith. I think they would all see that as a historically significant contribution. But it was the business management of the Vatican over the last 8 years. I mean, they had lived through the cause célèbre over the Holocaust-denying bishop in 2009, this massive embarrassment. The perceived mishandling of the sex abuse crisis from Rome. The Vatican leaks scandal, you all remember this, which ended in the arrest of the Pope's butler as the mole? I mean, a team of Hollywood screenwriters working for months around the clock could not have scripted something more surreal than that. And I think the Cardinals, frankly, were sick of, getting out of bed in the morning, worrying about what the next bomb in Rome that was going to go off would be, okay? So they were looking to break with what they saw as a dysfunctional pattern of governance in Rome and bring in somebody who would clean things up, turn things around, okay? And so Bergoglio, even though he was an extraordinarily attractive candidate in 2005, he was not the obvious candidate of continuity in the way that Joseph Ratzinger was. In 2013, in many ways, he was the obvious candidate for change. Never worked a day in the Vatican in his life, a complete outsider to that environment, and yet someone who profiled as having extensive experience of administration and management. I mean, bear in mind, in Jorge Mario Bergoglio, we're talking about a man who was made the provincial superior of the Jesuits in Argentina at the age of 36. I mean, basically, his entire adult life has been devoted to ecclesiastical administration. So I think the Cardinals looked at him and they said, well, this is a guy who is not part of the mess that, we're trying to fix, but who has the profile of someone who can get it right.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned that the Pope gave this speech about bishops and the election of bishops to have the smell of the sheep.
Right.
And yet, this week, your colleague Michael Sean Winters indicated what he termed a countersign this week when, with the appointment of the new Archbishop of Hartford, who oversees currently the LCWR, the reform of the LCWR.
Right.
He calls that a countersign and questions whether the certain influences of the nomination of bishops who have the ear of the right congregations in Rome, if those people were involved in making the appointments, such as like Archbishop Blair, for example. And also wondering about the recent CDF publication about divorced and remarried Catholics in L'Osservatore Romano, and which seems also to be it's sort of counter to what the Pope had indicated about maybe looking at the Orthodox position on allowing divorced Orthodox persons to approach the sacraments again. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on your sense about these apparent countersigns in the church where the Pope seems to be saying one thing about the smell of the sheep and also about pastoral solicitude to remarried divorced Catholics, and also the appointments of bishops in the United States.
Okay. First of all, I said earlier, you've established your credentials of Catholic identity. You have now established your insider credentials, because those are deeply insider questions. But look, when it comes to the appointment of Stephen Blair to Hartford, I don't want to take any position on the appointment. I actually happen to like Bishop Blair a good deal, and I've known him over the years. But I think descriptively what we can say is that Francis, in terms of personnel right now, is operating on a concentric circles model. The only thing he's personally engaged with right now is personnel in the Holy See. Okay, when it comes to the world's episcopacy, I think that's a kind of second-tier exercise. And of course, as you probably know, there are now more than 5,100 bishops in the world. It's completely unrealistic to think that any pope is going to be personally engaged in all of that. Frankly, my own suspicion is that the first American nomination that he will take a personal interest in is the choice of the new Cardinal Archbishop in Chicago. In terms of the Congregation for Bishops, it's true that he hasn't made any appointments there, so it's the same cast of characters that were determining the appointments under Benedict, who are still doing it now, and I think probably over time that will evolve. Personally, most of us in Rome expect that in relatively short order, Francis is probably going to name Cardinal O'Malley to the Congregation of Bishops, who will become the new kind of American kingmaker, and that will probably have a certain effect on the kind of person who is chosen. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you are concerned about Blair, and not everyone is, not everyone would agree with you that this is a countersign, but if you are concerned with that, what I would say is Bergoglio really has not gotten to choices of American bishops yet, so pazienza, okay? Now, as far as your second point about the divorced and remarried, it is, of course, true that Francis has hinted publicly twice that he is open to a more generous position on the issue of admitting divorced and remarried Catholics to the sacraments, and in particular to communion. And of course, that's part of the reason that he called the Synod of Bishops next October on this particular issue. Now, what's happened in the meantime, however, is that there are a lot of people who are sort of jumping the gun and getting ahead of the Pope. The Archdiocese of Freiburg in Germany, for example, put out a 14-page pastoral document basically saying the old dispensation is gone, and use your own judgment. And I think there are a number of people around the Pope who are concerned that basically that what has been created is an overheated climate of expectations, and so they're trying to sort of rein things in so that changes will be adopted in Rome first before they're actually implemented on the ground. The danger here is, on this issue, the divorced and remarried Catholics, is that we're going to have in 2013 and 2014 a repeat of what happened in the late 60s when John the 23rd created a commission on birth control, right, which was continued under Paul VI. And on the ground, everybody assumed that meant that the teaching was going to change. And so, then when it didn't, of course, this created a kind of fault line in Catholicism that never really went away. I don't think anybody in Rome is interested in a repeat of that. And I think Bergoglio, Francis, is committed enough to collegiality that he's willing to wait to see what the Synod has to say before he commits himself. So it is at least notionally possible that he's going to decide that the time is not yet ripe to make this. If that's what he hears in the Synod, if that's the overwhelming sense of the bishops of the world and the other participants in that Synod, I think it's at least conceptually possible that he would say we need to wait. And I don't think he wants to create a climate of expectations that is so intense that if that's the decision that comes out of the Synod, the church is going to explode. And so I think some of the attempt to kind of dial down the expectations, both, Lombardi's statement that, the church should not get ahead of the Pope and the statement from the CDF are intended to accomplish that. It does not mean, however, if the question is, if there's a cabal of blue meanies in the Vatican who are trying to rein in the Pope, right? Like undercut him and censor him and so on. I understand historically why you might think that, but if there is one ironclad certainty that I can give you about Jorge Mario Bergoglio, based both on his track record in Argentina and also his first 8 months as Pope, this man is not being reined in or censored by anyone. Okay, so I guarantee you that if at the end his pastoral judgment is we need to go ahead on this, that's what's going to happen.
You were talking about the Pope having a ministry of mercy. I was just wondering if this was something that the Pope had adopted early in his bishopcy in Buenos Aires as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I mean, his motto, this line from the Venerable Bede about, having mercy and choosing, that was also his episcopal motto in Buenos Aires, and it was very characteristic of the man. I mean, I'll tell you this, one of the things I did when I was in Buenos Aires is that I went to one of the slums there, which the Argentinians call the Villas Miserias, the villas of misery. It was this particular villa is the parish of the Virgin of Cacupe, which is the national patron of Paraguay, because many of the people who live there are poor immigrants from Paraguay. And I was interviewing the pastor there, a guy by the name of Juan Isasmendi. And I said to him, okay, this thing about Bergoglio being the Pope of the slums and, the Pope of mercy and all of that, is that actually real? Or, to what extent is that just PR versus to what extent is it real, And he said to me, listen, don't take my word for it. Walk out into the street and just ask people what they think, okay? So I took my translator, and we walked out into the street of this slum, and I stopped about 8 people at random, and I said, well, Bergoglio is supposed to be famous for his commitment to mercy, okay? Particularly with regard to ordinary people, okay? Is that real? Do you know what all of these people did? Before they even verbalized a response, every one of them ran back into these little tin shacks or wooden shacks that they lived in, and they came back to me with these kind of tattered, prized photos that showed Bergoglio baptizing their kids, or confirming their nephews, or sitting in their living room holding their hand when their husband had died. Okay, and their answer was, you want to talk about Bergoglio and mercy? Here it is, So no, this is not something he simply invented since he became Pope. I mean, this is very much tracks with who he was before. Do you want to know something that is new about him as Pope? Here's something. If you talk to the average person in Argentina and you ask them, is this the guy you knew in Buenos Aires, the one you're seeing as Pope of the Catholic Church right now? Almost to a person, they will tell you, no, it isn't. And what they mean by that is, yeah, his commitment to the poor, his commitment to mercy, his simple lifestyle, I mean, all of that they knew very well. But they'll tell you that when he was in Buenos Aires, first of all, he was not media friendly. I mean, he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires for 15 years. He gave a grand total of 5 interviews. He's already done 3 as Pope, and they've all been blockbusters, right? They will tell you he avoided the public spotlight like the plague. I mean, he would turn down 9 out of 10 invitations he got to appear in public. And when he did, reluctantly and against his own druthers, do it, most people will tell you he came off as boring, dull, and gray. Right? So these people, I mean, his own sister, for God's sake, Maria Elena, who I interviewed in her home outside Buenos Aires, told me, I don't know this guy. Right? So it begs the question, right, where does this transformation come from, right? Now, I mean, I'm operating the assumption that, this kind of enthusiasm and this love for ordinary people and all of that, I mean, all the stuff that explains his charisma, it was all inside of him, but we have to explain, why does he feel more able to let that out now than at any previous point in his career, okay? And there I think we have an answer, okay? Francis gave an interview to a leftist, non-believing Italian journalist by the name of Eugenio Scalfari in early October. And Scalfari, actually, he did not take notes and he didn't record the interview. He went back to, this is typical Italian journalism. Then he goes back to his office, 2 days later and kind of puts it together, okay, with these extensive paragraphs that are allegedly direct quotes from the Pope, which, And so he jumbled some of the details. I mean, for example, he had Francis, after his election, being so overwhelmed by being elected that he left the Sistine Chapel before he accepted, and according to Scalfari, went into a small room next to the balcony on St. Peter's Square. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you've ever been to the Vatican, the first thing you know is there is no small room next to the balcony on St. Peter's Square. And secondly, every cardinal who had been in that room said this never happened. But what Scalfari got right is that there was a kind of mystical moment that night where before he stepped out onto the balcony, Francis did have a moment of prayer and something happened to him. And the reason I know that Scalfari got that right is because I had a conversation shortly after this interview appeared with a cardinal who had been in to see Francis, who has known him for decades. By the way, not an American, so don't start guessing who it is, okay? Most of you would never have heard of him, but a guy who's known Bergoglio for a long time, who went in to see him and told him point blank, he told me, he pointed his finger at Francis and said, "You were not the same guy I knew in Buenos Aires. Okay, what happened to you?" Okay? And Francis's answer was that the night of his election, he had a moment of prayer. He had an experience of the presence of God in which a sense of interior freedom and interior peace came over him that has never left him. And I think that is part of the picture in terms of what has freed this man up to be, in full public view, the man he was potentially, all the way along during his career. And by the way, let me tell you, folks, I think when it comes to understanding popes, we dare not undersell the importance of mysticism. Okay? I mean, whatever else you want to say about a pope, these are true Christian believers who understand themselves with respect to divine providence and salvation history and so on. I mean, with John Paul II, do you remember during the twilight of the John Paul years, there was a lot of talk about whether or not John Paul would resign, right, as he was getting sicker and sort of declining in public view. Do you all remember there was a lot of speculation? And of course, he never did, and Benedict did. But I was profoundly convinced that Wojtyła would never resign. And the reason is that this is a man who believed that the Virgin Mary changed the flight path of a bullet on May 13th, 1981, to preserve his papacy. That was the day of the assassination attempt in St. Peter's Square. It was also the feast of Our Lady of Fatima. And if you look at where Mahatma Eliatka was standing in St. Peter's Square that day, and you do the physics, that bullet that he fired should have ended up in John Paul II's heart. And instead, it ended up a few inches to the left in his rib cage. On the first anniversary of that event, John Paul went to Fatima to put the bullet the doctors had removed from his body in the crown of the statue of the Virgin at the shrine of Fatima to thank her for her intervention. Now look, if that is your worldview, if you believe that the Virgin Mary, in effect, suspended the laws of physics to preserve your papacy, I don't think you ever just get out of bed one morning and say, "You know what, I've had enough." Right? I mean, you have to understand the imprint of the kind of spiritual and mystical dimension of how these men understand their papacy in order to really make sense of it. And similarly with Francis, he has made it. He did an interview with Vatican TV in which he talked about this as well. I mean, he has explained in a variety of different venues that something happened that night. I mean, I've talked to people who were in the conclave, not in this case, not cardinals, but people who were assistants in the conclave, who will say that when Bergoglio walked out of the Sistine Chapel, his eyes were locked on the floor, he was hunched over, his face seemed wrought with anxiety, it seemed like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. And then he veered into the Pauline Chapel, and he had a moment of silent, private prayer in that chapel. And when he got up, he was beaming, he was liberated, he was loose, and then, of course, he stepped out onto the balcony, and we all know the rest of the story. There was some brush with the divine that night that I think goes some of the way towards explaining why his own sister doesn't recognize the guy.
We have time for one more question,
okay.
And we'll go on the right-hand side.
Yes. For the last 40 years, I've been working for the ordination of women in the Roman Catholic Church. Is there any hope you can give us?
Well, I don't think you necessarily want hope from me. I'm not in charge of anything. But listen, I mean, we know what Francis has said. I mean, this question came up on that hour and 20-minute press conference aboard the papal plane. And what he said was that door has been closed by John Paul II, and he doesn't intend to reopen it. So I think the plain, descriptive answer to your question is, at least for the time being, the answer is no. Now, of course, that's not all that he said about women. He also said that he wants to enhance the role of women in the church, beginning in the Vatican, and that he wants to stimulate a deeper theology of women. And of course, in his Jesuit interview, he came back to that point. He said that women are asking questions that need to be heard. So, listen, I think Bergoglio profiles in that sense as the kind of standard moderate Catholic position on the women's ordination question. I mean, if you want me to do a little political, taxonomy, I think the liberal Catholic position on women priests is we should have him, we should have had him yesterday, okay? The conservative Catholic position would be that there's no women's problem in the church, everything is cool. I think the moderate Catholic position would be this issue of ordination has been taken off the table, but we do have a woman's problem, okay? There is a perception out there in the street that the Catholic Church is a boys' club. And we have to do what we can to address that. And I mean, this is why I don't think it's any accident that if you look at everything in the Catholic Church that doesn't involve a Roman collar, I mean, in the United States, we actually outperform virtually every other social institution in terms of the promotion of women. 25% of the diocesan chancellors in the United States are women, which is basically the CEO position under the bishop, right? 48% of all senior diocesan positions of any sort are women. 85% of lay ecclesial ministers is women. Now you compare that to Fortune 500 companies, or to the American military, or to top 100 American law firms, and look at the percentage of women who sit on the boards of major law firms, who occupy grades in the military of captain or above, or who sit on the boards of directors of Fortune 500 companies. The Catholic Church is in the vanguard. And I think that's because there are a lot of bishops and other church leaders out there who recognize that we need to do what we can to promote leadership, visible, meaningful leadership by women in every way we can, short of sacramental ordination. So applying that to Francis, when he says that he wants to promote the role of women in the church, I mean, beginning in the Vatican, okay, what would that look like? Well, I think, for example, it would not surprise me a bit if the next spokesperson of the Holy See is a lay woman, who is sort of the face and voice of the Pope. It would not surprise me a bit if the next head, say, of the Vatican Labor Office is a woman, or other meaningful positions, inside the system. So I think that's what he means by that. As far as the deeper theological conversation about women, remember that Bergoglio is not a theologian. I don't know that he necessarily has an endgame in mind. But I think what he has is a pastoral instinct that this is important, and he wants to stimulate a conversation and see where it goes. So bottom line is what I'm telling you is I certainly cannot suggest that Pope Francis is offering you any hope on the ordination question. What I can suggest is on the broader question of the role of women in the church. I think Francis is in a full, upright, and locked position on the importance of pursuing that issue.
What about the lack of job security for Roman Catholic women in the United States in positions in the church?
You mean like lay ministers and stuff? Well, that's not a problem just for women. The truth of it is that if you work in a diocesan chancellery or you work in a parish, you don't have the same guarantees of job security that bureaucrats in civil services would. So if there's a change in pastor or there's a change in bishop, that person can bring in their own team. That may be something that Francis gets to down the line. All I can tell you is that right now I have not heard any conversation around that particular issue as a papal priority. That said, I go back to my point of departure. I think this Pope sees mercy as the cornerstone for everything, and so I think when issues of personnel policies come up, I think the Francis effect would be to ask the question, what would a merciful personnel policy look like in practice, and are we there yet? And I would suspect that even without him necessarily need to saying it out loud, just the impulse he's provided is going to lead people around the world to raise that question. Okay?
Thank you.
Wait, hold on. Before you turn off my mic, one other thing I want to say, which is I don't want this to be the end of our conversation. That is, I don't just want to parachute out of here and have no further relationship with you. So let me make you this offer. If there's ever any way I can be of help to someone in this room, I don't actually have any earthly idea of what that might be, but if you're in a graduate seminar and some question comes up that you think I might be able to recommend some reading for, you're in an adult faith formation course in a parish someplace and there's a Vatican rumor boiling and you want to do some rumor controller. For God's sakes, ladies and gentlemen, if you're coming to Rome and you want restaurant recommendations, this is where I really shine, by the way. Whatever it would be. And yes, by the way, I am aware that it is a real burden of my office that so much of my work is done over lengthy Italian meals, but I want you to know I am over there carrying the cross for all of you. whatever it is. I have an online column that is called All Things Catholic. If you're just going to Google or Bing or whatever your preferred search engine is, All Things Catholic John Allen, you'll find it there. My email address is at the bottom. And I do respond to that. Now, if you're going to contact me that way, I would please ask you to put Boston College or something in the subject line. So I don't think you're the 9th Nigerian prince today who's going to give me $30 million if I just give you my bank account details. But assuming you permeate my spam filter, I would be delighted to be of help if I can, because I run around all over the place talking a great game about the need to foster unity in the church and overcome some of these tribal antagonisms. But obviously, if I mean that, I have to walk my own talk. So what I'm telling you is that if I can help you, it would not be an imposition. It would be an opportunity for me to feel like a person of integrity. So please do take advantage of that. And, ladies and gentlemen, go Sox, win it tonight.